What would you do if your neighbor decided that your backyard wasn't really yours? What if, no matter how many rules you followed, someone was always watching, always waiting to tear down whatever small joy you had? I never expected that buying a simple barbecue grill would turn into a full-blown neighborhood war. But that was before I met Karen. It all started on a warm summer evening, the kind where the air smelled like freshly cut grass and the sun lingered just a little longer in the sky. I had spent months saving up for this moment, finally setting up the sleek, stainless steel barbecue grill I'd dreamed about. I could already picture it, weekends filled with the sound of sizzling steaks, cold drinks in hand, and laughter echoing through the backyard. It was going to be perfect. Then Karen happened. She wasn't just a neighbor, she was the self-proclaimed ruler of our little community. If something didn't align with her version of how things should be, she made it her mission to fix it, whether that meant scolding kids for playing too loudly, complaining about holiday decorations that were too bright, or calling the HOA over the most trivial issues. People whispered about her, warned new residents to stay on her good side. I had heard the stories, but I had never been on her radar. Until now. As I adjusted the grill's side burner, I heard the sharp click of a gate swinging open. I turned just in time to see Karen marching across my lawn, arms crossed so tightly they might have been glued to her chest. Her expression? Pure disapproval. "You can't have that here," she snapped, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who thought they owned the entire street. I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" She pointed at the grill like it was a ticking time bomb. "A grill? It's against the rules." That was news to me. I had read the HOA guidelines from top to bottom before buying it, and there wasn't a single mention of grills being prohibited. "I don't think that's right," I said, keeping my voice steady. Karen smirked. "Well, it's a fire hazard. I'll be reporting this." I sighed, already exhausted. "Karen, I'm not breaking any rules. It's my backyard." "We'll see about that," she snapped before spinning on her heel and storming back toward her house. I shook my head and brushed it off. Just another power trip. No big deal. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright yellow notice taped to my front door. "Immediate action required, barbecue grill violation." I felt my stomach drop as I read the fine print. My grill was now classified as a potential fire hazard and had to be removed within 48 hours. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. I stared at the notice, gripping the paper so tightly that it crumpled in my hands. A violation? For what? I had read every single page of the HOA guidelines, and there was absolutely nothing about grills being prohibited. But I didn't need to read between the lines to know exactly who was behind this. Karen. Annoyed but determined, I marched back inside, grabbed my laptop, and pulled up the HOA rulebook. I scrolled through every section, searching for any mention of outdoor grills. Nothing. If anything, I knew for a fact that at least 3 of my neighbors had grills sitting in their backyards, and no one had ever received a violation. So why was I being singled out? I grabbed my phone and dialed the HOA office. After being transferred twice, a woman with a professional but tired voice finally picked up. "Homeowners Association, this is Linda speaking. How can I help you?" I took a deep breath, keeping my frustration in check. "Hi, I just received a violation notice about my barbecue grill, but I've gone through the community guidelines, and I don't see any rule against it." There was a brief pause. "Let me check," Linda said, the sound of pages flipping in the background. A minute later, she let out a small sigh. "You're right. There's no rule prohibiting grills. However, we did receive a complaint from a resident stating that it poses a fire hazard." "Of course. Karen. With all due respect," I said, jaw tightening, "my grill is brand new, meets all safety regulations, and is positioned far from the house with no overhanging trees. If there's no rule against it, why am I being told to remove it? Another pause. That's a fair point, she admitted. Let me escalate this to our board and get back to you. I thanked her, feeling a small sense of victory, but I knew better than to think Karen would let this go. And I was right. That evening, just as I was finishing up dinner, I heard a loud knock on my door. When I opened it, Karen stood there with two HOA board members, an older man with glasses, who I later learned was Mr. Lawson, and a younger woman, Ms. Carter, holding a clipboard. Karen folded her arms with a smug expression. You didn't remove the grill. I crossed mine right back. Because I'm not breaking any rules. Mr. Lawson cleared his throat. We're here to conduct an inspection. I stepped aside, motioning for them to follow me into the backyard. Karen walked in with an air of triumph, like she had already won. Ms. Carter wasted no time, jotting notes as she walked around the grill. She checked the distance from the house, the placement, the model number, everything. Finally, she looked at Mr. Lawson and nodded. It's positioned correctly. No trees nearby. The model meets safety standards. I don't see any violations. Mr. Lawson adjusted his glasses and gave Karen a pointed look. Agreed. There's no issue here. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. But it's a nuisance. The smoke could bother people. Ms. Carter raised an eyebrow. Karen, we can't enforce rules that don't exist. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line, but she had no choice but to accept defeat. The HOA members left, and I watched as she stormed back to her house. I should have been relieved. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately gagged. A putrid stench filled the air, **** rotting garbage, spoiled milk, something fishy that I didn't even want to identify, ***. My stomach twisted as I turned the corner to my backyard. My brand new grill was covered in filth. Someone had dumped trash all over it. I didn't need to guess who did it. But proving it was another story. My jaw clenched as I surveyed the mess. I had two choices, give in to Karen's harassment or fight back. And if there was one thing I refused to do, it was let her win. Instead of storming over to her house, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures from every angle. I checked my security footage, fast-forwarding through the night. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I saw her. A shadowy figure creeping into my yard, a garbage bag in hand. She wore a hoodie, but the streetlight near her house illuminated just enough of her face. Karen. I had proof. I could have called the police right away, but I wanted to handle this smartly. Instead, I composed a short email to the HOA, attaching the footage and photos. Subject * vandalism on my property. To * HOA Board. Dear HOA Board. I recently received a violation notice regarding my barbecue grill. However, I believe there is a more pressing violation that needs immediate attention. Please see the attached photos and video footage of a resident vandalizing my property. How does the HOA handle acts of vandalism? Best. Ethan. I hit send, took a deep breath, and started cleaning up the mess. I made sure to adjust my camera angles, just in case Karen tried anything again. By the afternoon, my phone rang. The HOA president, Mr. Thompson, was calling. Hello, is this Mr. Ethan? His tone was serious. Yes, speaking. We received your email, he said, his voice tight. And I must say, we're quite shocked. Vandalism is a serious matter, and this footage is very concerning. I smirked. I thought so too. We'll be calling an emergency board meeting today. Would you be available to join? I didn't even hesitate. Oh, I'd be more than happy to. Karen thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. That evening, I arrived at the HOA clubhouse, my phone in hand, ready to present the undeniable truth. The board members sat in their usual places, their expressions neutral, but I could tell from the hushed whispers in the room that the footage had already done its damage. Karen, however, sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed, her face a mask of forced indifference. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and gestured toward me. "Ethan, you've brought forward a serious complaint. Please present your evidence." I nodded, walking up to the projector screen and connecting my phone. The moment the footage played, the room fell into complete silence. At 3:17 a.m. Karen appeared on the screen ***, sneaking into my backyard, a black garbage bag in her hands. She looked around, then hurled the foul-smelling trash onto my grill before scurrying away like a thief in the night. The timestamp and the streetlight's glow illuminated her face just enough, there was no denying it. I turned to Karen, arms crossed. "Care to explain?" She shifted uncomfortably but quickly put on an air of false indignation. "That could be anyone. You can't prove it's me." Mr. Thompson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Karen, the streetlight clearly shows your face." She fidgeted, grasping for an excuse. I was just taking out my trash. Maybe some of it fell onto his grill." I raised an eyebrow. "At 3 in the morning? Convenient." The young board member, Ms. Carter, shook her head in disbelief. "This is completely unacceptable behavior for a resident. Vandalizing a neighbor's property is a serious violation." Mr. Thompson turned to Karen. "You'll be facing a fine for property damage, a formal complaint added to your record, and since this is your second offense, filing a false HOA complaint against Ethan was your first, your HOA privileges will be suspended for 6 months." Karen's mouth fell open. "You can't do that." "We can, and we will," Mr. Thompson said firmly. I leaned back in my chair, satisfied. Finally, justice was being served. But Karen wasn't done yet. The next morning, just as I was about to enjoy my first peaceful day in weeks, I heard a loud knock at my door. Annoyed, I opened it, only to find a city inspector standing on my porch. "Morning, sir. We received a complaint about unsanitary conditions on your property. There were reports of strong odors and potential pest infestations." My stomach twisted. "Karen." I nodded slowly. "Would you mind showing me exactly what the complaint was about?" The inspector led me to my backyard, and the moment I turned the corner, I nearly gagged, right by my fence, where I just cleaned up the previous mess. Another pile of garbage had appeared overnight. This time, it wasn't just rotting food, there were raw meat scraps, fish guts, and broken eggs scattered everywhere. The smell was absolutely putrid. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, resisting the urge to lose my temper. Instead, I pulled out my phone and accessed my security footage. Fast-forwarding through the night, I found exactly what I expected. At 4:02 a.m., Karen, once again, sneaked into my yard with another bag of trash. This time, she dumped it right next to the fence, likely hoping that if it was closer to the property line, I'd get blamed for it. Without saying a word, I turned the screen toward the inspector. His brows shot up as he watched Karen casually toss rotting meat onto my property and walk away like it was just another chore on her list. The inspector let out a long breath. "Well, that certainly changes things." "I'd say so," I muttered. He pulled out his notepad. "Since you have clear evidence that this was done maliciously, I'll be closing this complaint against you immediately." He glanced toward Karen's house. "And I'll be making a report about the actual violator." For the first time since this mess started, Karen was officially on record with the city for her behavior. But she still wasn't finished. That night, just as I was winding down, my phone buzzed again, an email from the HOA. Subject: unauthorized security cameras on your property. I felt my eye twitch as I read the message. The HOA was now claiming that my security cameras were non-compliant with community guidelines and needed to be removed. Unbelievable. Karen had tried to get me in trouble for my grill. That didn't work. She vandalized my property. That backfired. She filed a false health complaint. That failed spectacularly. And now? She was trying to strip away my ability to record evidence. But I was ready for her. I immediately dug through the HOA rulebook again and found the section about security cameras. It clearly stated that residents were allowed to install cameras for personal property surveillance. I attached that section to my reply and added a simple question. If my cameras are a problem, does this mean every doorbell camera in the neighborhood is also non-compliant? Or is this only an issue because I caught someone committing vandalism? I hit send and waited. The next morning, the HOA emailed back, stating that after further review, my cameras were not in violation and I wouldn't need to take them down. Karen had officially lost every battle she started. But just when I thought it was over, she pulled one final, desperate move. The day before my first real barbecue, as I was setting up my grill, I heard sirens. 2 police cars pulled up in front of my house. I walked onto my porch, confused, as 2 officers stepped out. One of them, a tall guy with a no-nonsense expression, greeted me. "Are you the homeowner?" "Yes," I said warily. "We received a noise complaint and a report of an unauthorized gathering." I blinked. The barbecue hadn't even started yet. Karen had called the cops on me preemptively, hoping to get my event shut down before it even began. I let out a slow exhale, rubbing a hand down my face before gesturing toward my backyard. "Feel free to check. The grill isn't even on yet." The officers exchanged glances before walking around my property. They found nothing, no loud noise. No people. No violation. One of them sighed. "Looks like a false report." I nodded. "You might want to check with my neighbor, Karen. She has a habit of filing complaints." They glanced at each other again, then toward Karen's house. One of them walked up to her door and knocked. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching as Karen hesitated before answering. A few minutes later, the officers left without saying another word to me. But Karen? She looked shaken. For the first time, it was her who had to deal with the consequences. And the next day? I fired up my grill, neighbors stopped by, and we had the biggest barbecue party the neighborhood had ever seen. And Karen? She watched from her window, completely powerless. The smell of sizzling steaks and seasoned burgers filled the air as my backyard transformed into the community barbecue I had always imagined. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance began filtering in, drawn by the aroma and, more importantly, the spectacle of someone standing up to Karen and winning. People brought their own drinks, side dishes, and even a portable speaker, turning my once quiet gathering into a full-blown neighborhood event. Laughter echoed, the sound of clinking glasses and the occasional cheer rising above the music. Karen, of course, was watching. I didn't need to turn my head to know that she was standing by her window, peeking through the blinds, her fingers undoubtedly curled into tight fists. She had done everything in her power to stop this. From weaponizing the HOA to filing false complaints, from vandalizing my property to even involving the police, she had tried every dirty trick in the book. And yet, here I was, flipping burgers and laughing with the very people she had spent years terrorizing. I expected her to sulk in silence, to accept her defeat quietly, but I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to admit when she'd lost. The next morning, an email from the HOA landed in my inbox. Subject: Emergency HOA Meeting, Immediate Attendance Required. I sighed, already knowing what this was about. Karen must have called for one last desperate attempt to shift the blame. Fine. If she wanted a battle, I had plenty of ammunition. When I arrived at the HOA clubhouse, I wasn't surprised to see that Karen was already there, seated stiffly with her arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, glanced between us before addressing the room. We're here today to discuss a recent series of complaints and incidents that have disrupted the harmony of our community. Karen jumped in before he could continue. Yes, and I'd like to file a formal complaint against Ethan. He's been disruptive, hosting unauthorized gatherings and causing disturbances late into the night. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head as I pulled out my phone. Is that so? Because I happen to have footage of my so-called unauthorized gathering. I played a short clip, one of neighbors chatting, soft music in the background, people enjoying their meals. Nothing loud, nothing out of control. Ms. Carter frowned. Karen, I don't see any disturbances here. Karen's nostrils flared. But the smoke. It drifts into my yard. It's unbearable. I folded my arms. Funny, I checked the HOA guidelines again last night. There's nothing in there about barbecue smoke being a violation. Unless you're planning to shut down every grill in the neighborhood, this argument holds no weight. A murmur rippled through the board members. Mr. Thompson leaned forward, rubbing his temples. Karen, you've already received multiple warnings for filing false reports. Now, we have video evidence of you vandalizing a neighbor's property, setting up a false fire hazard, and even involving city inspectors under fraudulent claims. Karen's face turned pale. That's not. Mr. Thompson cut her off. Enough. We've reviewed the footage, and the board has reached a decision. Effective immediately, you are being fined for property damage, placed on HOA probation for 6 months, and your voting rights on community matters are suspended. Karen shot up from her chair. You can't do that. We can. And we are, Ms. Carter said firmly. The room was silent. Karen's face twisted with rage, but there was nothing she could do. She had lost. I should have been satisfied, but there was one last thing I needed to do. I stood up and pulled out my phone. You know, Karen, I was willing to ignore a lot of this. The petty complaints, the harassment, even the vandalism. But you crossed a line when you called the police on me for something I didn't do. Her eyes widened. I smiled. So, I took the liberty of forwarding all of my security footage to the local authorities. Turns out, filing a false police report is a crime. They said they'd be following up with you soon. Karen's breath hitched. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. I turned to Mr. Thompson. That's all I needed. I think we're done here. And with that, I walked out, leaving Karen frozen in place, knowing that this time, there was no escaping the consequences. The moment I stepped out of that HOA meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, relief. The battle was finally over. Karen had lost, and this time, there was no way for her to twist the situation in her favor. She had pushed too far, weaponized the system against me, and now she was paying the price. The HOA had stripped her of her influence, she was facing fines, and worst of all for her, she had lost the neighborhood's fear. The people she once bullied into silence had seen her exposed for what she truly was, a bitter, power-hungry nuisance. That weekend, as I stood in my backyard, flipping burgers over my now fully sanctioned barbecue grill, I realized just how much things had changed. What was meant to be a quiet afternoon of grilling turned into a neighborhood event. One by one, people dropped by, drawn in by the smell of sizzling steaks and the promise of good company. Some brought drinks, others brought sides, and before I knew it, I was hosting the biggest cookout on the block. The same neighbors who had once tiptoed around Karen's wrath were now laughing, sharing stories, and finally enjoying the community without fear of unnecessary HOA crackdowns. And Karen? She was watching. I caught a glimpse of her peeking from behind her curtains, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. But there was nothing she could do now. The HOA wouldn't back her up, the police wouldn't entertain her false complaints, and the neighborhood? They had turned against her. She had spent years trying to control everyone, but in the end, all she had done was alienate herself. As I raised my drink in a toast, I realized something. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about winning, it's about showing people that they don't have to live in fear of petty tyrants. It's about proving that the right way, the smart way, will always win in the end. And if you're lucky, it comes with a side of barbecue. Have you ever had to deal with a Karen or an HOA that made your life miserable? Share your story below, I'd love to hear how you handled it.